You ever spend nearly a decade making sure someone else's world does not fall apart, only to be told you're just a glorified coffee runner? Because that is exactly what happened to me. My name is Dana Whitmore. I am 36 years old, born and raised in Tacoma, Washington. For the last 9 years, I have worked at a high-profile consulting firm in Seattle called Winthrop Strategies. My official title? Executive Assistant to the CEO. But do not let the title fool you. What I actually did could easily be mistaken for half a dozen executive roles rolled into one. Contract analyst, operations troubleshooter, client whisperer, crisis management strategist. I was all of it, in heels, while still remembering what brand of almond milk the CEO liked in his morning coffee. From the outside, my desk looked like the usual assistant station. Clean, professional, organized. But under the surface, I kept the company's legal and operational life from collapsing more times than anyone knew. While most assistants were expected to manage calendars and lunch orders, I was cross-referencing multi-million-dollar vendor contracts, flagging liability gaps in NDAs, and even walking clueless junior managers through last-minute compliance checklists. I was not just the first person in and the last person out. I was the quiet wall between Blake Winthrop's poor decisions and public disasters. The truth is, Blake never really understood how much of his success was built on the back of my discretion and ability to solve problems before they became headlines. Blake Winthrop, 45, was the kind of CEO who loved optics more than outcomes. He walked into every room like the lead actor in a movie only he could see, and everyone else was just a prop. Charismatic in front of clients, smug in private, and terrifyingly allergic to being challenged. He loved to remind people, especially women like me, that loyalty and knowing your place were the two most valuable traits in an employee. And for a long time, I played along. I smiled, nodded, and quietly fixed the legal messes his arrogance left behind. I did it because I believed in the work. I did it because I needed the paycheck. And yes, I did it because I thought one day, maybe, he would see my value. But that day never came. Instead, he saw me as someone safe to overlook. Someone dependable enough to dump work on, but invisible enough to never credit. You know what really stings? It was not just Blake. It was the entire executive circle. I sat in meetings where I handed over my research, watched him read my exact words off a PowerPoint slide I had written, and then listened as the room applauded his insight. No one questioned it. No one ever asked how the CEO had time to compile a 40-page strategy breakdown between golf meetings and keynote speeches. I was just the assistant, the girl behind the glass wall, unseen, unheard, uncredited. It was not always like that. In the early years, Blake actually listened to me. He would say things like, "You have a sharp eye, Dana," or "Good catch. This clause would have cost us." I thought I was building trust. I thought I was earning ground. But somewhere along the way, my competence became background noise. He started assuming I would fix things without bothering him. And if I ever pointed something out directly, he would brush it off with a tight smile and a wave of the hand. "You worry too much," he said once when I flagged a potential breach in a licensing contract. That contract later resulted in a lawsuit settlement, but of course, no one remembered I had said anything. Still, I kept going, because that is what women like me are trained to do. Work twice as hard, smile twice as much, and stay 3 steps ahead just to be seen as competent enough. But there was a moment, a specific moment, when everything changed. It was not even dramatic at first. Blake had made a snide comment in front of 2 executives from another firm. I had gently tried to bring up a legal issue I caught in a pending acquisition. Instead of listening, he laughed and said, "Dana, please, you are just my assistant. Let the lawyers handle the legal stuff." Just my assistant, in front of strangers. That was the first time I felt my stomach twist with something I had never allowed myself to feel at work before: anger. Not the kind of anger that makes you cry in the bathroom or vent to your best friend over wine. This was deeper, quieter, sharper, the kind of anger that stays with you, the kind that makes you start thinking. I went home that night and looked at my laptop. All those documents, all those saved emails, all those ignored warnings. For the first time in 9 years, I did not try to protect Blake. I started thinking about how I could protect myself. Because when someone thinks you are invisible, they forget to watch you. And when no one is watching, you get to plan. It started like any other late evening in the office. I was in the middle of prepping the final due diligence packet for an upcoming merger with a biotech startup called Arcadian Genomics. The deal was massive, valued at around $120 million. Blake was already rehearsing his victory speech. Our legal team was scrambling to finalize clauses, and I, the so-called assistant, was left to organize the files. Except for me, organizing meant reviewing every line of every attachment to make sure nothing came back to bite us. Because it always did. And 9 times out of 10, no one else caught it in time. That night, I caught something. I was deep inside a digital folder labeled Archive Contract Legacy Files. No one had touched that folder in over 5 years. I clicked through out of habit, not because anyone had asked me to. That is when I found it, a single PDF document dated March 2016. It was an addendum to a previous licensing agreement, one that had been signed when Arcadian was still a tiny research lab working out of rented basement space. The clause was written in dry legal language, but I recognized the problem instantly. It stated that if the company ever transferred ownership, through sale or merger, without a formal renegotiation of this license, the rights to the core software module would be available for purchase to any third party for just $5. Yes, $5 actual dollars. I must have read that sentence 10 times. Then I double-checked the contract ID. Then I triple-checked the version history. It was real. Somehow, this one addendum had never been voided, never amended, and never flagged in the due diligence reports. The worst part? That license was the foundation of our entire acquisition strategy. It powered the predictive model Arcadian used in its genome sequencing product. Without it, the startup's valuation would have dropped by at least 70%, meaning our firm would be throwing over $100 million at a hollow shell, and we would not even own the one thing we thought we were buying. I leaned back in my chair, just staring at the screen. I felt cold all over. This was not just a minor oversight. This was the kind of detail that could collapse a deal, destroy credibility, and end careers. I knew if this clause went public after the acquisition closed, we could be sued by shareholders for negligence. Our clients would lose faith, Blake would be humiliated. And the fallout? It would land hardest on the lowest rung of the ladder. People like me. People who were expected to know everything but had no authority to stop anything. I needed to tell someone. I needed to say something. But in that moment, I already knew how Blake would react. I still remember the last time I tried to bring up a contract issue. He had looked at me like I was interrupting a very important thought, then dismissed me with a smirk and told me to let the lawyers do their jobs. But the lawyers had missed this. Everyone had. I was the only person in the building who had actually read the original document and its addendums. And the reason I found it was because I had made it my habit to never assume anything had been handled properly. This was not luck. This was what I had trained myself to do. But now I was stuck in the same loop I had been in for years. Do I speak up and risk being ignored again? Or do I stay quiet knowing the disaster that might follow? I stared at the clause one more time. The words blurred for a second, as I imagined what would happen if some random third party discovered this loophole and filed the paperwork before we closed the deal. We would lose the license, possibly the company's trust, and absolutely every inch of leverage we had worked to build. I took a deep breath, saved the file under a new label, and backed it up on a secure drive. Then I printed a hard copy and slid it into a folder marked Urgent Review. That was my first move. Quiet, careful, calculated. I was not trying to be dramatic. I was trying to be responsible. But deep down, I also knew that I was preparing for the moment I would have to prove I was more than the assistant, that I saw what no one else saw, and that if this ship was heading toward an iceberg, I was the only one with a map. The next morning, I walked into the office early. My hands were shaking just a little as I held the folder with the printed contract addendum. I had barely slept the night before, turning over every possible way to bring this to Blake without triggering his ego. I told myself to stay calm, keep it professional, and present it as a helpful find. After all, this was not about me. It was about the company. It was about protecting a deal that could blow up in our faces. But even as I rehearsed the words in my head, I already had that sick feeling in my stomach. The one that warned me this conversation was not going to go how I hoped. Blake was already in his office when I knocked. He was on a call, laughing at something loud enough for me to hear through the glass. I waited. When he waved me in, I walked over and placed the folder on his desk. He gave me a quick glance and raised an eyebrow like I had just dropped off dry cleaning instead of a legal time bomb. I cleared my throat and said, "There is something in the Arcadian contract you need to see. I found an old clause that might—" I did not even finish the sentence before he cut me off with a wave of his hand. "Dana, not now. Legal already reviewed all the files. If it was important, they would have flagged it. You handle coffee and calendars. Let the grown-ups talk strategy." His voice was light, almost joking, but the condescension hit like a slap. I froze. For a moment, I was not even sure I had heard him correctly, but the look on his face made it clear he was not kidding. Blake genuinely believed that I had overstepped just by bringing it up, that I should stay in my place, smile, nod, go back to printing spreadsheets and double-checking flight itineraries. I stood there for a second longer than I should have. Part of me wanted to push back, to tell him exactly what was at stake. But the other part of me, the part that had watched him dismiss women in meetings, roll his eyes when someone younger than him offered an idea, and undermine smart people just to feel bigger, knew better. I nodded, picked up the folder, and quietly walked out of his office. As I pulled the door shut behind me, I felt something shift inside me. I was not angry, at least not in that moment. I was stunned, not just by the words, but by the absolute certainty that I was on my own. I sat at my desk, staring at the file. I could feel my pulse in my ears. That clause was still sitting there, still real, still dangerous. And now I was the only person who knew about it. I thought about going to legal directly, but I had seen what happened to employees who went around Blake. It never ended well. Reports got lost, people got sidelined, quietly let go. I was not going to be the next one pushed out the door for doing the right thing. But I also was not going to let this deal crash and burn without a fight. I started thinking through my options. Who else would listen? Not Marcus in HR. He owed his entire promotion to Blake, not Tracy in legal. She was too loyal to the executive chain. I realized that if I wanted to make a move, it had to be calculated, quiet, smart. I was not going to yell. I was not going to beg. I was going to act like the strategist he never saw me as. Because Blake had just made the worst mistake a leader can make. He ignored the only person who had taken the time to see the problem before it exploded. And by doing that, he gave me the one thing I never had in this company: complete clarity. I saved everything. I backed up my notes, archived the document on an encrypted drive, and sent a timestamped summary to my personal email. Not because I was planning anything drastic, yet, but because I needed to protect myself. Blake thought he had shut me down, but all he had really done was show me that no one was coming to fix this. Not the board, not legal, not him. It was just me now. One woman, one folder, and a ticking time bomb buried in a deal worth $120 million. And while he was too busy playing king of the mountain, I had just been handed the keys to the whole thing. After that meeting with Blake, I knew I could not wait for someone else to step in. The clause was real. The risk was massive, and the silence around me was deafening. So I reached out to the only person I trusted to help me think clearly, my old mentor, Clara Denton. She had retired from corporate law 5 years ago and now taught contract law at a university in Portland. I sent her a message asking if she had time for a call. 2 hours later, I was explaining the situation, word for word, with the addendum open on my laptop. Clara listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Dana, you are not crazy. That clause is real, it is active, and you are right to be concerned." With her support, I took the next step and consulted a contract law specialist named Mark Leland. I had met him during a workshop on intellectual property 2 years earlier and remembered how thorough he had been. I sent him the documents and told him I needed to know if it was legally possible to activate the clause. He reviewed it over the weekend and confirmed everything I feared. The language was clear. If no formal renegotiation was made before a transfer of ownership, the license would become available to a third party for $5. And since no renegotiation had taken place, no amendment, no superseding clause, I could legally file a claim to transfer that license. He asked, "Are you trying to block the deal?" I told him no. I was trying to prevent a disaster. He just nodded and said, then let us make sure you do this right. We filed the paperwork 3 days later. Everything was done through the correct legal channels. The original agreement was still binding, and the company holding the rights had made the license dormant, not expired. That meant the clause could still be triggered if the condition was met, and it had been. I filled out the necessary forms, submitted the transaction fee, and transferred the license to my own name, legally, cleanly, and without delay. $5. That was all it took. No pushback, no questions. I received the confirmation email within 48 hours. Just like that, I held the rights to a piece of intellectual property worth millions. I did not tell anyone, not yet. This was not some revenge plot or emotional stunt. It was a safeguard. Blake had refused to listen. The legal team had overlooked a critical detail. The board had no idea. If this license got scooped up by a real outsider, some competitor or bad actor, we would be looking at months of lawsuits, public fallout, and a merger collapse that could stain every name on the deal. I had no interest in taking the company down. I just wanted to keep it from falling apart because someone else was too proud to listen to the person who saw the train coming. For the first time in years, I felt a strange sense of control. Not power, not arrogance, just control. I had done something that no one else in that building would have dared to do. I followed the rules, I followed the facts, and I made a decision that protected the company, even if the company had never protected me. The irony was not lost on me. Blake spent every day surrounded by advisors, consultants, and lawyers. Yet he had ignored the one person who actually read every word. I was the invisible strategist, the quiet fixer, and now, the legal owner of the most important asset in the deal he thought he had already won. I printed out the confirmation, locked it in a folder, and placed it in my home safe. Then I waited. I watched Blake make speeches, watched the board celebrate progress, watched the legal team pat themselves on the back. Not one of them knew what had happened. Not yet, but they would. Because when the time came to finalize the deal, they were going to discover that the license they believed they owned was no longer theirs. It would not be a scandal. It would not even be a fight. It would just be a fact, a quiet, unshakable truth sitting in black ink on a piece of paper, a truth they had been warned about. And when that moment came, I would not have to shout or argue or explain. I would just hand them the file and let them read what they chose to ignore. The quarterly meeting had just ended. It was held in the main conference room on the 22nd floor, where the walls were all glass and the air smelled like polished wood and power. Blake stood at the head of the table, still riding high from his presentation. He had spent the last 45 minutes talking about strategy, growth, and how the Arcadian genomics deal would be the company's biggest move this decade. Everyone in the room had clapped when he finished. Everyone but me. I sat quietly in my chair near the back, watching him speak as if he had already sealed his legacy. I waited until the room cleared out before I approached him. My folder was tucked under my arm and my pulse was calm. I had thought through every word. "Blake," I said, keeping my voice even, "we need to talk. There is something about the Arcadian deal that you missed." He did not even look up from his tablet. "Not now, Dana. I have press follow-ups and a call with Tokyo in 20 minutes. I stayed where I was and opened the folder. "You are going to want to see this. It is about the license you think you are acquiring. It is no longer part of the deal." That got his attention. He looked up sharply, then narrowed his eyes. "What are you talking about?" I handed him the document. There was a dormant clause in the legacy contract. It allowed a third party to claim ownership of the licensing rights for $5, provided the terms were not renegotiated before the merger. You ignored my warning, so I activated the clause. The license is mine now. Mine. His face turned red so fast I thought he might explode. "You did what?" he shouted. "You cannot do that. You are a secretary, Dana. You do not get to interfere in multi-million-dollar acquisitions." I stood firm. I followed the law. I followed the contract language. You were warned and you dismissed it. This was not sabotage. This was a safeguard. You left a critical vulnerability open. I closed it. That is when I heard a voice from behind me. "Excuse me," said Elaine across the board chair. She had re-entered the room quietly and stood just inside the door, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "Did I hear that correctly, Dana?" Blake turned pale. "Elena, this is a misunderstanding." "She is confused." "I am not confused. I said, turning to face her. I tried to warn him. He ignored me, so I followed the legal process to protect the license before someone else could take it. The documentation is all here. I have the filing receipts, time-stamped copies, and confirmation from legal counsel. Elena walked slowly into the room and took the folder from my hands. She flipped through the pages without rushing, her eyes scanning each one like she had done this 100 times before. Blake was silent, probably hoping this would blow over in a minute. But it did not. Elena looked up after a few moments and said, "This needs to be discussed immediately. Blake, clear your next hour. Dana, you are coming with us. I am calling a closed-door board session, now." I followed her out of the room, barely hearing my own footsteps. Everything was happening quickly. But I was not afraid. I had told the truth. I had followed procedure. And most of all, I had done what no one else had done. Paid attention. Inside that boardroom, I laid out everything. The original clause, the backup files, my warnings, the dates, the proof. I did not raise my voice. I did not get emotional. I simply showed them what was missed and what it could have cost. They asked questions. Some were skeptical at first, but the more I answered, the more the room shifted. By the end of the hour, the tone had changed completely. Blake looked like he had been punched in the stomach. And Elena? She gave me a look I will never forget. Not approval, not praise, something deeper. Recognition. That meeting changed everything. I had gone from invisible to unavoidable, not because I demanded attention, but because I had forced the truth into the light. And now that it was there, no one could ignore it, not even Blake Winthrop. Blake did not take the boardroom meeting well. In fact, he barely made it through the next 24 hours before launching a counterattack. By the time I arrived at the office the following morning, my badge would not scan. The light blinked red at the door, and the security guard awkwardly told me there was a temporary system issue tied to my account. I knew right then it was not a glitch. It was retaliation. Blake was furious, and when powerful men get cornered, they strike. Fast, loud, and without thinking through the consequences. Unfortunately for him, I had been preparing for this since the moment he dismissed me in that office. I finally got inside through the side entrance thanks to a friend in facilities. But when I logged into my computer, I was immediately locked out of my email and internal systems. The screen flashed with a notice. Access suspended pending investigation. I just stared at it and let out a breath. So this was how he wanted to play it. No apology, no conversation. Just an attempt to erase me from the system and frame it as protocol. It did not take long before I received the HR summons. A formal meeting was scheduled for the next day to discuss concerns regarding your recent actions. I read the email twice. No specific charges, no names, just vague language dressed up to sound neutral. But I knew exactly who was behind it. That afternoon, a letter from legal arrived at my home. It accused me of unauthorized interference with pending company operations, and warned of potential disciplinary action. It read like a threat, but underneath the surface, it was all bark and no bite. They were testing me, trying to scare me into silence, hoping I would crumble under the pressure, apologize, or withdraw my claim to the license. But once again, they underestimated me. I had seen this exact tactic used against junior employees for years. Use policy language as a weapon, isolate the target, then quietly push them out. But I was not going anywhere. What they did not know was that I had already hired legal counsel. Carla Nguyen, a brilliant attorney who specialized in employment retaliation cases, had taken my call 2 days earlier. The moment I saw this coming, I prepared my side. Carla had walked me through every document, every file, every legal action I had taken regarding the license. We gathered proof that I had followed contract law precisely. I had not broken into company property. I had not stolen intellectual material. I had used a publicly available clause that anyone could have accessed, but no one else bothered to read. Carla called it airtight. I called it justice. I spent that night organizing my notes, timestamps, and communications. I pulled copies of the backup log showing the clause's existence long before I activated it. I printed Blake's earlier dismissive emails. I even downloaded the security logs proving I tried to inform him before taking action. By the time I walked into the HR meeting the next morning, I had a full binder labeled, "For internal review, legal protection packet." I slid it onto the table without a word. Marcus Lynn from HR glanced at it, then looked at me nervously. The company lawyer, Tracy Mendez, was there too. Her face was tight, unreadable. I kept my voice steady. I am here voluntarily. I have followed every rule. If you intend to accuse me of misconduct, I suggest you read that packet first. And I should also mention that my attorney has already filed a request for a formal legal response if any disciplinary action is taken against me. There was a long silence. You could feel the shift in the room. Tracy opened the binder and began to scan the contents. Marcus kept fidgeting with his pen. No one had expected me to come in prepared. They thought I would panic, beg, or fold. But the truth was, I had known this was coming. I had been underestimated my entire career. I had survived on instinct, preparation, and a quiet kind of strength that no title could measure. I was not just defending myself. I was defending the right to be taken seriously when no one else believed I should be. Let them come for me. I was not backing down. Not now, not ever. When I received the official notice from the board requesting my presence for an independent review, I knew this was bigger than Blake's temper tantrum. This was not just damage control anymore. This was structural. Elena Cross, the board chairwoman, had been quiet during the chaos, but apparently she had been watching everything unfold. She had called for a full internal audit, discreetly, thoroughly, and outside of Blake's reach. The notice made it clear. I was to bring any and all documentation related to the license transaction, any communication I had attempted with executive leadership, and any material relevant to company compliance. I showed up 30 minutes early, in a black blazer and a calm state of mind. I had spent the last week gathering receipts, not metaphorical ones, actual, tangible evidence. I had email threads that showed I warned Blake about the clause before acting. I had memo drafts he refused to read. I had timestamps of the digital audit trail leading up to my $5 purchase of the dormant license. I even had Blake's own signature on a compliance checklist he clearly had not read, dated just 3 days before the merger proposal. I walked into that room carrying 3 thick folders, labeled and color-coded. I was ready. Elena sat at the center of the long boardroom table, surrounded by 2 external compliance officers and a corporate attorney who did not work directly under Blake. That was the first good sign. Across from me sat Marcus Lynn from HR. He was fidgeting with his tablet, eyes darting everywhere except in my direction. I placed the folders in front of me and waited. Elena looked up from her notes, locked eyes with me, and said in the clearest voice, "Thank you for coming in today, Dana. Let us go through this properly." They began with simple questions. When did I first become aware of the dormant clause? Had I consulted anyone before acting on it? Did I receive approval from anyone in leadership? And what was my understanding of the potential impact? I answered each question carefully, calmly, without guessing or embellishing. Then I opened my folders and walked them through the paper trail. Every document had a date, every action had a reason, and every decision had already been backed up by legal counsel. I explained that my intention was not to interfere with the company's operations, but to prevent a catastrophic oversight that could have cost the firm $120 million and handed core licensing rights to a third-party buyer for nothing. When I finished my explanation, there was a silence. Elena slowly closed the folder she had been reading. She leaned back slightly, arms crossed, and looked directly at Marcus. Then she turned to me and said, "You followed the law. Your CEO did not follow logic." Her voice was even, but firm. It was not a compliment. It was a conclusion. She was not praising me. She was stating a fact for the record. Marcus shifted in his chair and finally looked up, just for a second before dropping his gaze again. He said nothing. He knew what this meant, even if he did not want to admit it out loud. The external compliance officers nodded and took notes. One of them asked if I had been pressured or retaliated against since the transaction. I said yes, and then laid out the suspension, the legal threats, and the HR meeting that was meant to intimidate me. I showed them the access logs that proved my accounts had been locked immediately after Blake was informed about the license transfer. I showed them the letter from legal and the vague misconduct notice. Elena's expression never changed, but Marcus was now visibly sweating. It was clear he had been pulled into Blake's mess, and now he had no clean way out. The meeting ended with a quiet formality. Elena stood up and said, Thank you, Dana. We will be in touch within the week. Please do not discuss the contents of this review with anyone until the board makes its official determination. I nodded and left the room with my folders still in hand. No one walked me out. No one offered fake sympathy. And I did not need it, because I could feel it. Something had shifted. Blake was no longer the only voice that mattered. The board was awake now, and Elena Cross had just made it very clear. This time, they were listening. It started with a calendar invite. Subject line, emergency executive session, attendance mandatory. It came from Elena's office and was sent to the board, senior legal counsel, and a handful of department heads. I was not invited, of course, but I did not need to be in the room to know what was about to happen. The evidence was on the table. The facts were no longer under Blake's control. The votes had already been cast in whispers and hallway glances. Now it was just time to make it official. That same afternoon, an internal memo was circulated through the company. It was short, sterile, and carefully edited. Effective immediately, Blake Winthrop has been placed on administrative leave pending further board review. Interim leadership will be provided by a designated transition team. There were no quotes from Blake, no thank you for his service, no fluff about pursuing new opportunities. Just a statement and a signature from Elena Cross. The man who used to stomp through the building barking orders had been reduced to a passive sentence in an email. The press caught on fast. By the next morning, 2 finance blogs and a niche business newsletter had picked up the story. They did not have all the details, but they knew enough. Leadership shakeup at Winthrop Strategies amid licensing controversy. One headline read. Another was more direct. Sources say CEO ignored red flags in a $120 million deal placed on leave. The PR team scrambled to release a public statement. It was vague, of course. We remain committed to responsible governance and are reviewing recent events with full transparency. That was corporate speak for we messed up and our CEO is probably not coming back. Inside the company, people whispered. Some were stunned. Others were not surprised at all. Everyone had their own version of Blake. Some had been shouted at, others dismissed, and a few quietly admired his charisma until it turned toxic. But now, those same people were watching the boardroom with wide eyes. The untouchable was finally being held accountable. For the first time, people saw that power was not permanent, not when it was misused, not when it ignored the truth standing right in front of it. I stayed quiet during all of this. No victory laps, no smug grins, no office gossip. I still came to work every morning like nothing had changed. I sat at the same desk, drank the same coffee, and filed reports like I always had. Because for me, this was never about revenge. It was about responsibility. About making sure that someone in power did not drag everyone else down with his pride. About showing that just because someone talks the loudest does not mean they know what they are doing, especially when they refuse to listen to the people trying to help them. What no one saw was the private email Blake sent to me 2 days after the vote. It came from his personal address and had no subject line. Just one sentence. I hope you are proud of yourself. I stared at it for a long time. Then I closed my laptop and walked outside. I did not respond. I did not need to. Blake had written his own ending the day he told me to stay in my lane. He had the opportunity to listen, to act, to take responsibility. Instead, he mocked me, ignored facts, and clung to power like it would shield him from consequence. In the weeks that followed, Elena announced that a new compliance framework would be rolled out across the company. Independent review panels, mandatory training for all executives, and an anonymous escalation system for overlooked concerns. She also made it clear that all employees, not just board members, could raise red flags directly. It was not a revolution, but it was a start. And people noticed. People started speaking up a little more, watching a little closer. Blake's downfall had left more than a vacancy. It had opened a door. Some called it karma. Some called it justice. I called it inevitable. Because the truth has a way of surfacing, even if it takes years. And in a world where silence is often rewarded, I chose to speak. I chose to act. And in the end, I did not just survive Blake Winthrop. I outlasted him. 2 weeks after Blake was placed on leave, I got an email from Elena's office asking me to meet with her and 2 board members. I assumed it was a follow-up to the internal audit, or maybe something about transferring the license documentation formally. But when I walked into the room, there was a manila folder on the table with my name on it. Elena smiled and slid it toward me. Inside was a formal offer. Director of Operational Risk and Strategic Compliance. A new role, a new team, a whole new floor. I took a minute before saying anything. It was not that I doubted the offer. It was that I wanted to be absolutely clear about what this meant. "Why now?" I asked. Elena looked me straight in the eye. "Because you saw what no one else did, acted when no one else would, and held firm even when every door was being closed in your face. We need that in the room going forward." She did not over-explain it. She did not soften the truth. She just gave credit where it was due. And that was more than I had ever gotten under Blake's leadership. I said yes, not out of pride, not out of pay. I said yes because this time it was earned, not handed, not assigned because I smiled enough in meetings or managed someone's calendar. It came from results, from actions, from proving with receipts and resolve that I had been right to raise the alarm, that I had done the company a favor, not a disservice, that being underestimated had nothing to do with my ability and everything to do with someone else's ego. Moving into the new office felt surreal. It was on the 17th floor, 2 levels above where I had spent the last 6 years scheduling meetings, printing out quarterly reports, and sitting silently through strategy briefings. Now I was the one invited into those meetings, the one reviewing risk matrices and advising on compliance strategy. I even had my own assistant, which felt strange at first. I kept catching myself reaching for the coffee pot or double-checking calendar, invites out of habit. Old rhythms take time to fade. But what changed most was not the floor or the title. It was how people looked at me now. Suddenly, I was not just Dana from operations. I was Dana who found the clause, Dana who saved the merger, Dana who stood her ground when no one else would. Colleagues who used to overlook me in the hallway now asked for my input. Some apologized, quietly. Others just nodded a little longer when they saw me. I did not hold grudges, but I did not forget either. Respect given late is still respect, but it does not erase the silence that came before. My business cards do not say assistant anymore. They say director. The nameplate outside my door matches. I have a budget, a seat at the decision table, a team that trusts me. But honestly, the title was never the goal. I do not need a placard to know what I am worth. That was the lesson Blake never learned. Power is not about yelling in meetings or having the biggest office. It is about clarity, knowing who you are, what you bring, and refusing to let anyone shrink that. Looking back, I do not regret a single step. Not the late nights, not the dismissive comments, not even the day Blake told me to stick to coffee and calendars, because every piece of it built something stronger. And now, I use that strength to protect others who might be in the spot I was in, unseen, unheard, but carrying sharp instincts and quiet courage. I look for them, I advocate for them, because one voice is never enough, but one voice that gets heard, that changes everything. This was never about revenge. Not really. It was about setting a new standard, about proving that integrity still has a place at the table, about showing what happens when someone underestimated steps fully into their power. I earned this title, but more importantly, I earned back my voice, and I will never let anyone take that from me again.